Good afternoon, good evening. Thank you all for coming to see us. So this is one of our first attempts to do a sort of presentation talk at the university, or at the festival on behalf of the University of Brighton. We both teach on the Film and Screen Studies degree programme there, so we do a lot of work on cinema. We also do work on television and digital games and basically anything involving screens. That's what we're really interested in. This is going to be what's going to happen today. We're going to talk for about half an hour. I'm going to give a kind of 15 minutes general talk about cult media and what makes media cult, particularly focusing on cinema, because that's the form of cult media that most people are familiar with. And then Douglas is going to then follow it up with a talk about...
I'm going to be talking about what I call British folk horror. I think in terms of cult films, The Wicker Man is probably the quintessential one. And who all here has seen The Wicker Man? Hands up. The original, obviously, not the rubbish remake. Good. Well, quite a lot of you, but I will avoid spoilers. So what I'm going to do is talk briefly about The Wicker Man, but I'm going to make connections with that and some other very culty types of screen productions, particularly in British television of the 1970s.
Okay, great. So we're probably going to talk at you for about half an hour. So apologies in advance for that. And then what we're going to do, Douglas is going to distribute. I think we've got post-it notes and pens.
Yep.
In an attempt to get some kind of audience participation. And what I'd like you to do with these, or what we'd like you to do, is to put right on these examples of cult media. Now, I'm going to be talking about film, but I'm going to be also talking about how we might think about cult novels, cult television programs, maybe cult video games, even sort of cult food. If there's any kind of cult that you can possibly think of. And then once we've finished doing our talk, we're going to see if there are any questions. If you've got any questions, please do feel free to ask them. And then we're going to maybe use those as a way of kind of discussing the breadth of that term cult. So, okay.
Oh, thank you.
Brilliant. So yes, just to start off.
I can get some from the front. Actually, hang on.
Okay. So yeah, just to start off, I'm saying, so what is it that makes a cult film a cult film? So we might think of. If we think about cult movies as a kind of genre, they don't really work in the same way as other kinds of genre. If we think about something like, say, like the Western. Now, the Western is a group of films. They all have something in common in terms of their textual composition. They all look the same, they all sound the same, they all feel the same. Westerns are all set in a particular time, in a particular place. Yeehaw indeed, thank you very much. They're associated with certain iconography, certain visual and also certain audio iconography. They have certain kinds of characters, certain kind of narrative themes, certain kind of stories get told in Westerns, certain kind of storytelling structures. So in other words, there are textual elements which make a Western a Western. So we think about things like gunfighters, ranchers, rustlers, sheriffs, cowboys, Indians, tensions between the kind of wilderness and civilization, issues to do with modernity and masculinity. These are all the things which go towards making a Western. And most of us, if we're kind of flicking through the TV and a Western appears on the screen, we can usually, most of us can recognize that almost immediately. So the Western is a genre which is characterized by its, in the same way as most genres, by its textual continuities. However, if we think about cult movies, cult cinema, actually, cult cinema covers a whole range of films, which seems in terms of the way in which they look and sound, the kind of stories that they tell, seems to be completely dissimilar. So here are some examples that I think most people, although of course the term cult is hugely contested, most people would say, yeah, a cult film, Rocky Horror Picture Show, 1975, a musical, comedy, horror, with elements of science fiction. That's a classic cult movie. Blade Runner, 1982, is a science fiction film, a thriller about a bounty hunter shooting rogue androids. 1998, we've got The Big Lebowski, a film by the Coen brothers. Yep, indeed. What is your favourite quote from The Big Lebowski, sir?
Oh, I don't know.
Okay, well, if one comes to you, please do feel free to shout it out. So, sorry? Yeah, I asked that of a crowd once, and someone shouted out, "Shut the fuck up, Donnie." So I knew that my time was limited on the stage. So anyway, so Big Lebowski is a Coen Brothers film, a kind of comedy, sort of gangster thriller, mystery movie. And then finally we have The Room. I don't know how many people have seen The Room. I don't know how you would describe The Room, but on the surface of it, it's supposed to be a kind of melodrama, a love triangle between a man, his best friend, and his wife. Set in modern-day San Francisco, I think it is. So we've got all 4 examples of cult movies from different decades, and they don't really seem to have very much in common at all. You've got a science fiction, horror, musical, a science fiction movie, you've got a thriller, a melodrama, and then other examples. And again, one of the interesting things about cult movies is they don't seem to necessarily retain their cult status, and certain films move in and out of cultdom. So we've got something like Plan 9 from Outer Space, The Wicker Man, which my colleague will be talking about later. Die Hard, I think, is you could argue, Die Hard is a cult movie. Certainly it's been shown in various cult movie slots. Although, when I first started teaching film, I would quite often use Die Hard as an example of mainstream blockbuster filmmaking. We've got something like Faster Pussycat Kill Kill, a Ross Meyer movie. We've got Fantasia. Again, Fantasia probably wouldn't be considered a cult film now, but certainly in the 1960s, it got embraced by the counterculture, and certainly between its release in 1940 in the cinemas and its release on VHS, which I think was around the early 90s, in between that period, it has had a certain kind of cult status. Heathers, another film which arguably was cult even when it first came out in the late 80s. That was a film which was very much kind of riffing on the kind of 80s teen movie. So we've got all these films, they don't really seem to have very much in common. So we're thinking about what is it that makes a cult film cult. It's not really anything to do with the actual film itself. We might say there are certain kinds of things, science fiction, fantasy, horror tends to appear in this list, but it's much broader than that. So if we're thinking about what makes a cult film, we can sort of really forget about its actual textual composition, which is something which makes cult cinema quite unusual as a genre. Instead, what makes something cult is more to do with its exhibition or its broadcasting, the way in which it's distributed or retailed, the kind of audiences that it attracts, and also I'd say the kind of mythologies that surround certain kinds of films. And this is why for an academic studying screen studies, the whole notion of cult cinema is really interesting and really quite exciting, because it takes us out of the film and makes us start thinking about the ways, the things which surround a film, the practices that surround it. Yes, sir?
I mean, I would disagree wholeheartedly that Mamma Mia is ever a cult film.
Well, that's a very contentious issue, because there is an article which I read quite recently arguing that it is a cult film, that it's viewed in exactly the same way as people would view something like Rocky Horror. They gather together, they sing along to the music. It's consumed in a cult way. Now, it might not be cult to everyone, and certainly the fact that it's a mainstream film, which did well in the box office, would seem to preclude it from being a cult film. But again, it's contentious. One of the things about cult cinema is that it's open to discussion and open to debate. And certainly, we could argue that actually the Rocky Horror Picture Show isn't cult anymore. It's become too mainstream. I've had students who say that they used to dance the time warp at school discos, which suggests that it's kind of lost its kind of countercultural edge to a certain extent. However, it's still a film which comes up again and again whenever people are discussing cult movies. But yes, you're absolutely right saying, any of these examples that I'm putting on the screen are open to discussion. There's no definitive example of a cult movie. But instead of thinking about the text, we might move beyond the film, beyond the screen itself, to start thinking about things like how things are exhibited and broadcast. So one of the classic traditional ways in which cult movies gain their cult status is being shown at midnight movie screening slots. That's the kind of classic, the double feature, the kind of idea of the usually a kind of rundown cinema in a city, which is showing movies at midnight to stoners and students. And interesting, the actual location, the fact that this was a practice, and this is where a lot of kind of cult movies come from, is really significant, to the point where a lot of I've actually noticed some DVD retailers will retail a kind of double feature, reproducing that kind of almost mythological way in which a cult movie gains its status. We might also think about broadcasting. I mean, I remember in the old days of BBC Two, when television was what television used to be, watching Moviedrome with Alex Cox, who would introduce a film every week, things like The Terminator or Blade Runner or Brazil or Rumblefish, and there was a particular slot, and these screenings, these screenings, broadcastings, did kind of confer a certain cult value upon these films. We've got, Film 4 does its cult movie screening. So again, we're thinking about television is also part of the process where cult emerges. Elvira, Mistress of the Dark, I don't know if anyone's familiar with her. You're probably more familiar with... you are, great. With most people only really know her through Boobzilla from The Simpsons, but she used to introduce a series called, I think it's Movie Mayhem, on American cable TV. So again, showing these kind of like low-budget B-movies, which had gained a kind of cult status. Also, the way in which films are retailed in the 80s and also the late 70s and going on into the 90s with the DVD. We certainly, with the advent of VCR, we get companies which are selling certain kinds of movies, quite often advertising in magazines like Fangoria or Starburst. And we also have certain, if we think about retail, also certain kinds of retailers like Tartan Asian Extreme, which was selling particular kinds of Japanese horror cinema. And we might also think of, just around the corner, we have the Time Slip on Trafalgar Street, which explicitly says this is selling cult classics on DVD and video. And one time I remember going and looking in the window there as an example of the wide range of cult movies. We've got Run Lola Run, Escape from Planet of the Apes, Rita Sue and Bob 2. But these are all films which are being, which were in the window, which kind of suggest that these are also cult films. So again, we're thinking about the context as being really important. And of course, we have the audience. So films which attract a particular kind of audience, or films around which there is a certain kind of audience participation. Some examples there. Rocky Horror is obviously the classic one. We've got Big Lebowski, people going, dressing up as characters from the film, but also dressing up as objects from the film, and even things which people say from the film, which people will kind of dress up in these kind of elaborate cosplays. We've got The Sound of Music. Again, The Sound of Music, when it came out, was a blockbuster film. It was a big budget movie. It was very successful. It has subsequently been kind of reappropriated in a rather kind of camp way, and we have these sing-along a Sound of Music. And then, yes, of course, the Wicker Man, which my colleague is going to be talking about. There's also something interesting about the mythology which surrounds cult movies. Cult movies tend to be films which are seen as being unsuccessful when they first released, but gain a select audience as they gather, as their lifespan expands, continues. So, I mean, for best example of that is Blade Runner, a film which most people know didn't do very well when it was released in 1982. It's one of the first films to be released on Laserdisc, and so it managed to gather a kind of following through people who were really into their movies, and then kind of got rescued from obscurity by those kind of audiences. There's also lots of stories around Blade Runner, how the studios messed with the edit. I remember when the director's cut came out, and we were very excited because this was supposed to be the original version, and we subsequently found out, no, that wasn't the director's cut. The new one that's just come out in the cinemas, that's the proper director's cut. But this is a film which, again, there's lots of narrative surrounding it. I mean, The Room is another example of a film where the stories around the making of the film and the audience of the film were almost, I would say, more interesting than the film itself. And that's kind of the point of cult media, is that the narratives that surround the film are of more kind of value in terms of defining these films as cult than their actual kind of textuality. So we think about, cult movies is an interesting genre because it doesn't necessarily refer to the text itself, but rather the ways in which the text is circulated, the way that it's enjoyed, the way that it's appreciated. There's also, I'm just going to add a few extra things. I think it's really interesting the way that sometimes cult films are films which are considered to be particularly good and unappreciated by audiences of the time. So Blade Runner, but also something like Donnie Darko or Freaks. These are films which kind of like were taken out of the cinemas or were dropped by the studios, but then garner a reputation as quality films. But then cult films can also be films which aren't very good. Films like, films by Ed Wood, like Glenn or Glenda, or movies like the Tower of Screaming Virgins. I mean, these are films which... So cult movie kind of exists on this interesting cusp between quality cinema and trash cinema. And of course, you've got things like Brain Dead, which are deliberately supposed to be trashy. They're films which are made to be cult in some way. We also ask, the extent to which films become mainstream detracts from their cult status, or whether all the tropes of cult have actually been incorporated into the mainstream now. So the fact that Hairspray has become a musical and has now become a film of the musical. Or you might think about the Quentin Tarantino and Roger Rodriguez series, Death Proof, whether this reflects the mainstreaming of cult movies, the remakes of things like The Evil Dead, A Last House on the Left, even a kids movie like Monsters vs. Aliens, which is clearly drawing on the kind of B-movie tropes. And also referring to the point like my friend at the back there made, whether there is something political about what gets to be considered cult and what gets excluded from cult, because there is an argument that cult cinema tends to be quite masculine, and so films which attract a cultish female audience are less likely to be included in the canon than films which are appreciated by a particularly kind of like male cinephile audience. And we might expand our sense of cult, to think about things like TV. Cult television is interesting because quite often cult television does have proximity to quality television. Something like Twin Peaks was a mainstream film, but it's also a mainstream series, but it's also been considered a cult TV show. Something like Watchmen, can we think about cult graphic novels, although arguably there is already something a bit cultish about graphic novels. Can we think of cult musicians like someone like Tom Waits, who has coincidentally appeared in quite a lot of cult movies, things like Rumblefish and Down by Law, or cult video games. Are there certain kinds of video games that attract a cult audience, like Five Nights at Freddy's or Undertale, or cult movies? I recently read something about Dirty Burgers, saying Dirty Burgers represented a kind of London-y cult cuisine. So can we actually expand that notion of cult to incorporate a whole range of other kinds of media and culture? And at that point, I'm going to pass you over to my colleague Douglas, who is somewhere there. There you go, Douglas.
I know that applause was for Ewan, but it felt like I was just being applauded for managing to get up the stairs there. Thank you. I thought that as well. Okay, so I'm going to talk for 10 or 15 minutes about the cult of folk horror. And The Wicker Man is a very good example of folk horror, and I'll kind of unpick that in a wee bit more detail when I get to it. But I want to just talk generally about this kind of genre of folk horror. In 1966, the folklorist George Ewart Evans coined the term the pattern under the plough. And he means by that the way in which the built environment that we live in now is based on much, much older models going back sometimes thousands of years, going back to pagan times. This is a picture of the Rollright Stones in Oxfordshire, seen from above, and you can see the way the modern road here curves around the stones, and the field here also curves around the stones. And those stones were put there about 3,000 years ago. And so the modern roads and fields that we're still using today are based around stones laid down by people thousands of years ago. And Ewart Evans argues that it's not just the physical shape of the environment that we keep reproducing. We keep on building roads on top of ancient roads. We keep on building settlements on top of ancient settlements. But the culture, the practices, the music, the rituals, and the beliefs of pagan times persist into the present day in the same kind of way. So David Pirrie, who was a film critic, argues in the 1970s that horror is a British genre in the same way that the Western is an American genre. If the Western is all about the wide frontiers and about the lone horseman, in many ways, horror is a particularly British genre because it's about a very old, very overcrowded island that's been built over again and again and again. And this idea of ancient forces emerging out of the ground and out of the past is one that is persistent in British horror cinema. And some of the critics that I've listed there, people like Leon Hunt and Marcus Harms, have identified this strand of folk horror, but it's quite a small and contained group of films. It migrates into the 1970s through television drama. And I argue in a minute that there's a cycle of folk horror television in the 70s that works through issues of social change. It's both a geographical and cultural movement which is forming this change. It's the shift from agrarian village cultures in the Industrial Revolution into mass production and urbanized cultures, and people living in very concentrated ways in cities. And this is a very new way of life. It's also a move from an oral to written culture. And folk culture at that point, when you start to get the mass production of culture, starts to be demonized and suppressed. But at the same time, as with a lot of these kind of original, authentic cultures, there's also a fascination with it. It's exalted and romanticized. And folk culture and folk music get reworked and made suitable for wider consumption. For example, there's a general interest in the 1960s and 70s in folk music, and a lot of folklorists collecting folk songs before the people that remember how to sing them die out. There's also a sense in which this is about a search for an authentic kind of sense of British identity in a period of rapid industrialization, change in terms of social roles, and also a diminishing of Britain's role in the world. And Tanya Kraswinska argues that what these kind of texts explore is a psychogeography of Britain in which the landscape and cultural practices of the land are imbued with pre-Christian paganism. I mean, we might want to think about that in terms of the way in which quite a lot of the discourses around Brexit hark back to really quite outdated visions of British national identity now. So the key cinema films of the folk horror cycle are these three here: Witchfinder General, Blood on Satan's Claw, and The Wicker Man. And these movies are all tied into the folk horror, folk music revival of the time, the flower power movement, counterculture, youth culture, and the rural settings in which they all take place are key to folk horror. This is a still from Blood on Satan's Claw, and you can see the way it presents a very pastoral, very traditional, bucolic English countryside. That was shot in Oxfordshire as well. But you can also see the way in which it's made sinister by the colours and the lighting, and the way in which the branches in the foreground here seem to turn into a cage, trapping the characters within the landscape. And landscape is very important in folk horror, not only in terms of the forces that erupt from under the ground, but also in terms of the kind of national identities that are played out within these ancient landscapes. Rob Young talks about the way in which these films engage with the matter of Britain and the historical essence of place bursting into the present. And these films engage with the transition to modernity and a sense in which perhaps older pagan rituals might not offer some kind of authenticity and comfort. The image from The Wicker Man there shows the way in which it's all about ancient pagan rituals surviving into the present day. And one of the key themes of these kind of folk horror texts is buried objects resurfacing into the present. This is a still from Blood on Satan's Claw. Rob Young talks about the way in which a lot of these kind of films are about the disturbing of settled layers of history. And very often, objects are unearthed from the past that come up out of the ground and are not necessarily alone. It's about ancient religions and forces emerging from under the ground. And Peter Hutchings argues that what these films play with are anti-landscapes. If heritage drama like Downton Abbey presents a very cosy and consensual and very attractive view of the past, these are anti-landscapes in which the kind of landscapes that they explore are suffused with anxiety and threaten identity. Particularly in the modern ones, in which a key trope of those kind of texts is the way in which unwary urbanites travel into the countryside and they confront unstoppable forces from the past. As Leon Hunt says, this green and pleasant land forever resists the onset of the age of reason. And we see an image there from The Wicker Man, Christopher Lee getting involved in pagan rituals. So there's a very small corpus of folk horror cinema because the British film industry collapses in the 1970s. But what happens is that a lot of the concerns and images of folk horror migrate into television, and particularly BBC television drama. For example, there's a series of ghost stories for Christmas based largely around the works of M.R. James and Charles Dickens, produced by Lawrence Gordon Clark. And writers like Reza Negarestani and Mark Fisher have written at length about these particular TV programs and talked again about the way in which they very often are about things being dug up from the past, what they call inorganic demons or xenolithic artifacts. And they emerge out of the ground, things like bones and whistles and crowns, and they bring with them buried forces from the past. And the landscape is very important because round about this time there's an increasing use of film and location shooting in British TV drama. So the camera can go out and explore the landscape. And of course, pointing the camera at a landscape inevitably engages you with issues of national and regional identity. So you can see the way here, again, the trees create a cage. This is yet another of these M.R. James stories in which an eccentric academic goes into the country, starts digging up old objects from the past. In this case, it's a pagan crown, and discovers that it's accompanied by strange forces that he hadn't reckoned on. So this tension between modernity and tradition is one that marks these kind of TV versions of folk horror. The countryside, which is seen as being authentic and something that is tied to national identity, is threatened by outsiders who go into it from the city. But very often it's the urbanites who end up being consumed by these more powerful and more authentic settings for national identity. And these kind of programs engage with issues of technological advance, social change, unease about increased state control, and a sense that traditional values are being eroded. One of the earliest examples is a film by Jonathan Miller called Whistle and I'll Come to You, which is based on an M.R. James story. And you can see here again an eccentric academic digs up a pagan whistle, blows on it, it doesn't make any noise, but then he has an uncanny feeling of being pursued and being hunted. And you can see the way the camera is very close to the ground here, suggesting that something is about to erupt up from out of the past and from under the ground. We can't show any because of copyright and time, but these are mostly on YouTube if anybody wants to do any further viewing. And here are the title slides from some of the ghost stories for Christmas that the BBC did in the 70s. And you can see how important place is in all of these films. The opening shot is a deserted landscape with no people in it, but a sense in which there are lurking forces that might erupt at any moment. So to tie in with The Wicker Man, I want to talk a little bit for the last minute or two about a play for today broadcast by the BBC in 1970. And this is a modern play. It's about a woman who's a TV script editor, and she buys a cottage in the country in a little village, and she decides to do it up. And it presents the village as an ideal community, and this vision of the rural pastoral as being something that's very desirable to urbanites. But then, once she gets there, she discovers that it actually is quite difficult to leave this village. She finds some strange practices going on among the villagers, and there's a sense in which there's this kind of pagan community and pagan beliefs surrounding her. Again, it's about xenolithic artifacts. She digs up a strange half marble in her garden, which resembles a kind of a glass eye, and then she discovers that it seems to be watching her, and it stops her from leaving the village, and she keeps trying to leave, and she can't leave. And she eventually discovers that the villagers have got plans for her that involve, again, pagan rituals. And this is where the link to The Wicker Man comes in. And there are scholars who've said that it would be extraordinary if Robin Redbreast wasn't a direct influence on The Wicker Man, which came out 2 years later. It's all about rural superstitions, fertility rites, and unheeding city dwellers. And when we have a look at a couple of stills, one from Robin Redbreast and the one on the right from The Wicker Man, you can see the similarity, the way in which they both feature sinister villagers wearing horns. So there's a sense in which it's not just about the way in which cinema influences television in the 1970s, it's the way in which this cult of folk horror bleeds into a variety of different media. And there's something of a folk horror revival going on at the moment as well, and we might ask for people to shout out a few suggestions for examples in the second half of tonight's session. And one of the ways in which that folk horror revival is working makes me think that maybe folk horror, a bit like the xenolithic artifacts that keep emerging from out of the ground, can never be completely suppressed. As with a lot of cult culture, it's something that seems to be very difficult to kill. Thank you very much. Okay, do we want the post-its back?
Well, what I was going to do, I was thinking if you've had give everyone a little bit of time to maybe think of some examples. I've already got a couple here. American Werewolf in London, which I'm sure many people have seen, and Thundercrack, which is a slightly more obscure movie. I don't know, anyone's seen that anyway. But maybe while everyone's sort of thinking their own examples of cult media, are there any questions that or comments that anyone would like to raise? Any thoughts? And it's quite bright up here, so if you could.
Yeah, we can't see a thing.
Yeah. Any questions?
I've got an interesting.
Yes.
I've been firing for it, so lots of people ask me questions, and I had a discussion at the table about whether a reboot or a remake could become a cult classic, which is quite controversial.
Okay.
And we couldn't really think of anything except if maybe a horror film was taken, and was the only exception I can think of. Can you think? Oh no, please.
Oh, brilliant. Okay.
I don't need it.
That's right. I was just going to say that the question was if it's possible for a remake to become a cult movie, or if a reboot, or what you're suggesting is just by the definition of rebooting something, remaking it, it removes it of any cult significance.
I've thought of one. Yeah. Anybody, does anybody want to shout one out before I start talking?
Evil Dead 2.
Evil Dead 2.
Yeah.
Well, it's debatable, isn't it? Because I think he always said it was kind of like a remake. It does, but yeah.
See, I don't feel like is the reboot ever going to be a cult classic?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, things become cult and then they stop being cult and then they can become cult again. The example I was thinking of there, and it's from telly again, but it's Battlestar Galactica, because the original was very mainstream and pretty cheesy and very obviously a Star Wars ripoff. But then when they redid it in 2004, I think they very deliberately tried to make it very culty. They tried to give it a sort of narrative. You know, the original was a sort of monster of the week and a story of the week, and you could show the episodes in any order. But then the remake drew on the narrative complexity that quality television has now, these very, very long, season-long, multiple-year-long story arcs, very complex characters, very ambiguous characters. You can't really show those episodes out of order. So it's... Mm-hmm.
Well, I
we
remember
must
when
be able to think of one.
I was just thinking when Trainspotting 2 came out. My first thought was, well, that's the end of Trainspotting as a cult movie. It's kind of like if it gets remade for a mainstream audience, then it does. I think the kind of thing that you were saying, that something that's remade. The whole notion of a sequel does suggest the kind of commercialism that cult movies seem to be in opposition to.
But Trainspotting was a mainstream movie. It had a huge budget. Channel 4 funded it, and they gave it a huge budget, and they gave it a huge marketing budget. Mm-hmm. So it was always intended as a mainstream movie, even although it looks culty and it became culty and it attracted a cult audience. But it was always intended as a moneymaker.
Yeah. I mean, there's a big issue about whether something can be deliberately made cult, or if the very act of deliberation means that it can't be. So a cult needs to be something which has got some kind of grassroots following. But then that's really complicated by the fact that something like, Rocky Horror Picture Show starts off with a song about B-movie culture and midnight movies. So that already was working within kind of culty terrain. Whether that's quite necessarily a cynical move is open to debate, but I think there are some examples, and of course cult television, something like Battlestar Galactica, is, as you said, was deliberately made as a kind of cult artifact, and there's cult television and cult cinema work in very different ways.
Yeah, I do remember there was a thing called V, which, well, they just remade it a year or two ago, but does anybody remember the original V from the 1980s? Yeah, a couple of people. And I do remember reading somewhere that the producers deliberately made the costumes quite easy to copy because they wanted fans to make their own versions and go to science fiction conventions, and that would help to promote the series. So there's a sense there in which they're maybe not trying to make it cult in terms of having a small audience, but they're certainly trying to cultivate a cult audience that is going to have a particular function in terms of promoting the TV show. So I think, particularly for television, there is a desire, particularly now that there's a lot more understanding of how fandom works and how audiences work, the industry certainly is trying to make a mass audience do culty things, like buying loads of merchandise and watching the episodes again and again and again. Sorry, was that a hand up?
Yeah, I had just a quick question based on that, basically. Do you think that a lot of the films that we've talked about here are older, and that maybe the saturation of films today, the number of films coming out, the things that are really going under the radar, missing, we're all missing so many things. Do you think that potentially that cult kind of culture might go away, that those films, or it will become so culty that it will be so small you'll never notice it.
Yeah, and just become very niche. Yeah.
Tiny
that's a
pockets.
possibility.
I don't know. It's interesting because, of course, cult can be very local. I mean, I think that the cultiness of The Wicker Man does seem to be something which is quite local to Brighton, or at least there is a certain Brighton appreciation of with the sing-along of Wicker Man screenings. I don't know. I think there's always going to be a desire for audiences to cluster around things that are obscure. And maybe the obscurity just becomes slightly different. I mean, the example which, I mean, I know this makes some people cringe, but something like My Little Pony, the TV show, which some of you may know has attracted a cult male adult following. That seems to be almost maybe a kind of reaction to the mainstreaming of cult, that's actually attaching yourself to something which isn't even slightly supposed to be fanish or cultish, is the way in which an audience distinguishes itself from the mainstream.
In response to what you were saying about things being cultish now, my understanding before tonight was that if things were cultish, it was partly because they were spoken about and referenced about. So I kind of think of memes and viral videos as being cultish. Like, one that springs to mind is that one that came out years ago, which was what she was like, shiz. Oh my God, shiz. That one. Like, that has like the cult following, I feel, and it's referenced, and like I've seen people at parties as that woman. Like, so I don't know if what people think about that.
Well, I think we're tending to assume that cults form around particular television programs or particular films or maybe particular video games, but cults can form around actors and stars as well. I mean, that's basically what pop star fandom is, that it's a form of a cult. And going to a concert is quite culty. That kind of performative behavior of going to a concert, going to a convention. There is something a bit culty because those kind of rituals mimic religious rituals, going back an awful lot further, but they're sort of secular contemporary iterations of it. So there's something quite culty about audience behaviors as well as the actual object that we're seeing on screen, or the music or the performer. It's what the audience does that is culty too. So the kind of stuff you're talking about probably is culty behavior, yeah.
Well, I think it goes a bit deeper than that, because I think meme culture is all about like the soundbite, the snap, the very short, something which is very short, and of course what a lot of cult cinema has is it has lines which people recite to each other over and over again, like finest wines available to humanity, or really ties the room together. Those, and if you something like like The Big Lebowski seems to work well as a cult film because if you watch it, there's lots of repetition. There's lots of the same lines repeated over and over again. So it's almost like catchphrases in a kind of traditional sitcom. So I think that there is something about kind of repetition. And also sharing, because of course it is also about sharing. And I think it's something would like to do some work on the ways in which things like video and DVDs and YouTube have impacted on cult media, because of course one of the things that the cult is all about is about sharing something with other people that everyone else doesn't know about. So I think memes are a really interesting point of comparison. Yes.
Yeah, in terms of sort of cult films that haven't been mentioned, one film that came to mind was George A. Romero's Night of the Living Dead in the 1960s, late 60s. Do you think that film has helped revive an interest in the zombie franchise, which has ultimately culminated in series like The Walking Dead?
Well, I mean, it's a really, really influential film, because before that, the zombie was much more based on the kind of Haitian voodoo and William Seabrook's book The Magic Island from the 1930s, which explored the kind of voodoo approach to zombies. And they weren't threatening until Night of the Living Dead. And then they become a science fiction monster, really, because I think it's a science fictional explanation rather than a supernatural voodoo one. So it absolutely does change the role of the zombie in popular culture, yeah. And I think it is that version of it that we're now seeing in things like The Walking Dead. So yeah, it's a film that casts a very long shadow, if that's what you mean.
But then there's also the, I have to chip in there, the Resident Evil franchise. And I don't mean the films, I mean the video games. That I think the video game revived the zombie as a particular monstrous threat. So what we're kind of seeing is it's almost like the Romero zombie, it actually kind of disappears for quite a while. and then it's only really surfaces in video games because zombies work really well with the video games, and then for some reason, which I think is really interesting, then we have the kind of zombie renaissance, which we're maybe still in the middle of now, where zombies are everywhere, and they seem to be articulating something, like you were saying about horror. There seems to be something about the zombie that we're fascinated with, and whether it's the zombie or the notion of apocalypse, or having the opportunity to shoot loads of people and it's be fine, or what the zombie means has been the subject of quite a lot of academic discussion.
Well, it's endless consumerism, isn't it? It's the endless eating of brains. It's being insatiable.
I think there's lots of different perspectives.
Yeah.
And of course, there's different. There's crazy running zombies, and there's the kind of slow plodding zombies, and there's zombies that are kind of that are intelligent and that get rehabilitated, and there's the zombie, which is the horde, the mass of faceless monsters. I think there's lots of different perspectives on that. Definitely, I think there was someone at the back there.
Yeah, there's a couple of films you haven't mentioned tonight that I throw into the mix of British psychological folk horror from the 70s. One is Penda's Fen and the other is The Shout, both of which I think are brilliant films. Mm-hmm. Is there anything else you'd recommend as well to add to the list?
Oh, blimey. Well, I've got one of my slides has got a gigantic list of potential stuff on it. There's a thing called Stigma from 1979, which is again about standing stones. There's a children's thing called Sky, which HTV made in, I think, 1975, which again is standing stones, but it's really striking. It's got a lot of, it's very Penda's Fen-ish in terms of the imagery of the countryside, but it's got these very sinister autumn woods, and what happens in it, and this is slightly spoilery, but this all kind of is in the first scene, so it's not a huge spoiler if you decide to watch it. This boy from space lands in somewhere in the countryside round about Bristol, but because he's from space or from another dimension, the natural world starts trying to reject him, like antibodies. So you get all these sinister shots of autumn trees looming over him, and you get all these sinister shots of leaves moving to cover him up and consume him. So that's one I would recommend. That's quite Penda's Fenny, but it's children's TV.
Sorry, can you repeat the title of it?
It's just called Sky.
Sky.
Yep, 1975.
So do we have another question? Okay. No. Okay, but as I go around and collect up your examples of thank you very much. Okay. So we've got the Lost Boys and the Craft. I'm not sure what's the Craft. Is that is it Witches? Yeah. Okay. So that's a kind of teen movie, Witches teen movie. Okay, and then we've got Metropolis, Old Boy, Pulp Fiction. That's an interesting one. In what ways is Pulp Fiction a cult movie? Yeah. Certainly, it has that dress. I remember going to see the Reservoir Dogs, the Duke of York's. And I'd not seen it, and it had been out for a very long time, and there were people dressed up as because it's very easy to dress up as a character from Reservoir Dogs. But yeah, there's someone that started dancing during the trapped caught in the middle with you scene, and I remember as an audience being really quite horrified. For me, seeing that film for the first time, it was really quite a great, disturbing moment, and to see people kind of like dressing up and pretending that it was a lot of fun was really quite peculiar. But our students, I don't know if you students sometimes bring up Pulp Fiction as an example of a cult movie.
Yeah.
My recollection of Pulp Fiction was that it was mainstream. It was a film which was it's in all the cinemas. It was by this cult film director, but it was still quite a mainstream movie.
It was, but then I think again we're back to that thing of, is it the actual movie or the TV show that is cult, or is it what audiences do with it? And if you're going to watch it over and over again and learn all the lines and repeat them to your pals, and then I think that makes it cult. It's, I think, about intensity of engagement, really.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
That actually is, for me, I think, becoming a cult, but it's actually about the actor.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that he died,
Yeah.
passion there.
Yeah.
I think you're right. And
it kind of came back a bit, and then it nosedived again.
Yeah, but there's also something.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's something about reclaiming actors who are perhaps slightly past their prime and are perhaps doing work that is not quite worthy of them, and giving them some kind of credibility. And Tarantino does a lot of that. But yeah, there is something there about cult actors. And I think there's a sense in which the cult audience goes, well, we appreciate them even although the mainstream doesn't. We can see qualities in them that perhaps the mainstream has forgotten. So there's something about rehabilitation there as well. But there's also something about distinction and being a connoisseur of a particular performer. And sometimes that means you can be a connoisseur of a really bad performer and appreciate them for the innocent merriment that they give in that way.
Yeah, no, it's that thing that a cult appreciation can be appreciation of something which is really great, which nobody else appreciates, or it can be appreciation of something that's really awful and no one appreciates how enjoyable that is. And I think of, you mentioned the remake of the Wicker Man. I think of like Nicolas Cage, as one of the bees, as that's the example of an actor who a lot of people really enjoy his films because he's arguably not particularly good, but they're also like, I remember Harry Dean Stanton. He was in Repo Man in Paris, Texas. He was another performer who seemed to have when I was growing up, had a kind of cult following.
Mm-hmm. And also, I mean, somebody else who pops to mind is Judy Garland, who was a mainstream star in her youth, but then her very well publicized struggles with alcohol and husbands and things, she ended up becoming a bit of a cult figure as well, and particularly was reclaimed by gay audiences in the 60s, when again she was certainly struggling a bit with her career, and arguably was past her best, but then she was reclaimed in that way by a gay audience because there was a sense of identification with the struggles that she'd had.
Okay. The people at the front here have been very busy. So we've got Trolls 2, which I'm guessing you have to see Trolls 1 in order to understand it. Okay, right. So Trolls 2, just go straight to Trolls 2. Howard the Duck. Yes. I've not seen it. I don't know if is it available anywhere? Has it been taken off? Okay. Yes, because there's that was Lucas, wasn't it? George Lucas.
It was the original Marvel movie, and he's been shown in the newest Guardians of the Galaxy as well.
Right. Okay, so he's been
He has a little pop-up.
and presumably he has a kind of cult following because of this movie. Yeah. So we've also got True Romance. So again, Tarantino, I think, are like particular directors having a cult following. Oh no, he didn't. He wrote it, didn't he? Yes. Tony Scott, was it? Yeah. So and also Christian Slater, who had a kind of coolish cult following at the time. But then some examples. I mean, Lord of the Rings as a cult movie. Again, if we think that cult movies don't necessarily have to be low-budget movies that no one goes to see and are only appreciated by audiences after the time. So I think certainly Lord of the Rings is in contender. Daisies.
Daisies, it's like Czech Republic film.
Okay.
It's really cool. It was initially banned because it came out during when they were and they basically just some really gluttonous girls when they were writing.
Okay.
And it's fucking beautiful.
Right. Okay, yeah, Daisies is a banned film. I mean, films which are banned quite often gather that cult following, or films which are removed from release. I mean, that's why a lot of those kind of video nasties in the 80s gathered that kind of following, because they were really hard to see. Or I remember seeing, Douglas, you might have done this as well, seeing Clockwork Orange before it was re-released, and that being a really kind of exciting moment. And
I remember about 1990, I think it was. I was at a convention, and there was a secret midnight showing off a very grainy VHS with Dutch subtitles, and everybody rushed off to see it because it was before YouTube. It was the only way you could see it.
Yeah. Okay.
And in a way, that kind of enhanced it. It did feel illicit because it was actually illegal to be watching it at that point. So that did actually enhance the whole situation.
Well, it's interesting, that whole kind of aesthetic of video, because you watch a video now and it's got this crackly lines on it, and that in the same way as celluloid has a certain kind of resonance. And it's interesting if you're watching which of his Death Proof, or one of the Tarantino Rodriguez films, where there's actually a moment where the whole film just basically falls apart, and it's all digital, but it conveys a sense of kind of cultness to it.
Yeah, I was watching Mindhawk. Anybody seen Mindhawk, which just came out a week or two ago? It's a kind of a strange mashup of Jason King and Bergerac. And it's obviously kind of positioning itself as an instant cult classic. It's about a clapped-out 80s tele-detective who comes out of retirement. And just what you're talking about, there is a sort of VHS aesthetic to some of the scenes there as well. And then it turns out he's watching his old episodes on VHS because nobody will put them on DVD because they're terrible. But it sort of had a feel of an instant cult classic, that one.
Okay, we got, so it's pushing the boat out here. We've got hummus and avocado as cult foods, I'm guessing. Yeah. We've also got RuPaul's Drag Race, which is it again sort of culty. I mean, it's interesting though, thinking about like distribution and Netflix, and whether Netflix has a section which I'm sure is like a cult movie. So again, Netflix is part of that kind of process of definition. But well done for coming up with cult food. We've got Team America. Again, probably the fact that it's associated with the South Park guys. Harry Potter, another kind of mainstream one. Podcasts. My dad wrote a porno. Yeah. Okay, not seen that one. Is it good?
It's really good.
Yeah. Right, Cabinet of Dr. Zhivago.
It was like the first film to have a twist at the end.
Okay, cool. We've got memes, viral videos, Pet Sematary, based on the Stephen King. Wes Anderson, who I guess is a lot of. Has anyone seen the Wes Anderson X-Men video? Really, really funny. But Wes Anderson, and there's interesting thing about Wes Anderson again, like whether he was, it's a director who was deliberately engineered to be a cult director. We think about how he emerged as an auteur. We've got War of the Worlds, the radio play. Dare the Triffids. I remember being terrified of that as a child. Firefly, which of course got cancelled, which is probably one of the best ways to make a cult film TV show is to cancel it and not show the last few episodes. Then we've got Withnail and I, Princess Bride. Which I say I don't get Princess Bride. I've seen it loads of times. I just one of those films I just can't understand. I just don't understand it. Okay, have we got some more here? Excellent. Okay, Douglas, do you want to read out a few of these?
Thank you. So Inbred. Oh, yeah, somebody's written folk horror.
Yeah, I think it might be a newer folk horror.
Okay.
About a load of city people who go to volunteer to help clear up this thing.
Yeah.
One of them gets injured and they go to the local village
Uh-huh.
and they end up caught in this horrendously gruesome pagan stuff.
Oh, yeah, that does sound,
particular?
very
It's
folk
only
horror-y.
last year or the year
Okay. Well, I think there is a definite revival. I mean, has anybody here seen Eden Lake, which came out a few years ago? And again, it's about people, it's about people going off into the countryside from a city, and then they encounter the semi-feral locals. You can tell they're semi-feral because they've got a hot tub in their garden. So there's a very interesting thing about class and hugging a hoodie going on in that movie. It came out about 5 years ago, I think. It's Michael Fassbender. Just about the time he started getting really famous. So I think there's definitely something going on in this folk horror revival, which would sort of make me think that there is something culty about folk horror, because they tend to be things that people are quite intense about. Can anybody think of any other examples of folk horror? Yeah.
I was going to ask, I don't know if you consider it because it's not based in Britain, but The Witch that came out.
Oh, yeah, that's really, I mean, there's a slightly different strand of folk horror going on in America, because it's not it's a landscape. The British folk horror stuff is about our own ancestors and their forces and their rituals coming back from the past. So there's a sense in which the pagan past is coming back to haunt us. In America, it's someone else's past that's coming back to haunt because it's a colonized country. And so anything more than about 400 years old, and Australia, a lot of Australian cinema works in very much the same way. The landscape is out to get you. If you're white and you've left the city, you're going to be consumed. The Witch, absolutely folk horror, yeah. Deliverance is absolutely folk horror, American folk horror. Yeah.
I remember a children's program back in the early 70s. I don't know what it was, but it was like around about the time with Peter.
Mm-hmm.
And it was these children staying in a house out in the countryside, and these stones kept approaching.
Yes.
When they looked out of the window,
Yeah. It's called I think it's called, what's it called? I watched it not that long ago. No, it's not Children of the Stones, which is another example. It's 1977. I know the one you mean. It's called something like Dead of Night, and it's about a girl who's she keeps falling asleep and dreaming, and I think she's an invalid and she's in bed, and she keeps dreaming about these stones, and I can't remember what it's called. I think it was made in colour, but it only now exists in black and white. And as you say, these stones with eyes on them, and they keep getting closer and closer to the house.
Right, we are running out of time. I just want to. I mean, I don't know if we're going to get kicked out of here, but I think no one seems to be queuing up outside, or maybe they are. We've got a few more examples. American Psycho, Christian Bale again. Yeah, American Psycho, the novel as well as the movie.
I've got Spaced TV,
yeah,
which is sort of precision engineered to be culty because it's full of in-jokes and it's very much aimed at that kind of the sort of audience that are going to be receptive to a cult.
And was it the Cornetto trilogy?
Yeah. Playing Pink Floyd over Wizard of Oz. I don't know anything about this practice. This is a new one on me. Crystal Maze, somebody's written. Yeah.
Would it be cult if it didn't have Richard O'Brien in it?
Would it?
Probably.
No, well, that's a thumbs down there.
Yeah.
That film about Karen Carpenter with Barbie dolls. Oh, okay. I know the one you mean. I've heard of it, but I haven't seen it. Yeah.
Okay, we got a few more here. Cape Fear, the Martin Scorsese version. Natural Born Killers. Divine, which I'm guessing is the performer. I think I might have had an image of pink flamingos up there earlier.
Thank you. Vincent Cassel as a cult performer, filmmaker. Yeah.
We've got Paris is Burning, which I've neither seen nor heard of.
Oh,
am I missing out?
It's an early feminist film. It's a sort of documentary, early 70s documentary about drag culture. Yeah.
Okay, cool. And Dracula. Just Dracula. I mean,
just
I guess
generally.
like movies. They're different movies, but also Dracula as a thing, as a franchise,
as a character. Yeah.
And I mean, there's the annual. Isn't there an annual pilgrimage to
Whitby? Yeah. I mean, that's the other thing. We come back to actual cult activities. Do people going to Whitby in order to immerse themselves in the world of Dracula? Professor Matt Hills argues that one of the things that makes cult television is television drama with what he calls a hyperdiegesis, a hugely detailed story world that you can watch the program and and Battlestar Galactica is a bit like that, and The Walking Dead is a bit like that. But the people like fan practices of going and visiting locations and stuff like that, that's very culty. And there's something there about ritual. Again, it's going back to much older religious social practices of pilgrimage and visiting somewhere because you feel some kind of connection with the divine and then going home transformed by the experience.
Yeah, or going to a festival.
Going to
Brighton Festival could be
and being transformed by the experience.
Yes.
Okay, thank you both. That's been a very, very entertaining evening. Ladies and gentlemen, the two doctors, Ewan and Douglas.